Do it. Did I get it? Is it here? Push the button. Did that do the thing? And there we go. How you doing there, friends? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it might be in your part of the world. Welcome back to the live stream. My name is Fritz, and today we're going to be talking about Azure Functions. It's a good topic. This is a technology that I've been using a lot over the last 2 years. If you've been watching me over on my other stream, it's been a tremendous topic that we've been tinkering with, experimenting with, extending, and doing some very cool things with. But before we get to talking about Azure Functions, of course, this is a discussion framed. This is a very open discussion. It focused on you, the folks that are watching, type of live stream. I'm here to talk with you about things that are going on in Microsoft technologies, whether it's .NET, Azure, Visual Studio. I want to talk to you in the chat room about your questions and dig in and learn more about what kinds of things you're trying to do and how we can help you and answer some of your questions. So let me bring up the chat room. There they are, right over there. We've got a bunch of folks here. Unesco, hello, good to see you. Tejas Madan, hello to you on YouTube. There's another person here who has some characters for their name. How you doing on YouTube? Gabriel, hello, good to see you. Mark Dickin there, an SAP data migration consultant on YouTube. Hello to you in the UK. Good to see you. This is Serverless Fritz discussion today. Yes, that's right. Orthodox Forever is here from Serbia. Cecil Williams, you're happy to be here. Me too. I'm glad to be here. I've got my voice is a little hoarse here today. It's been quite the last few days. It's so good to see everybody wandering in. Anthony, how you doing there? Are Azure Functions better than minimal API? That's a really good question. And quite honestly, the answer is maybe. There's some things that Azure Functions do that are different than minimal API, and there are some things that it does that are the same. And I could very easily argue that minimal API is a little bit better at some of those things. But there's other things over here that Azure Functions is a lot better at. So we'll talk through a bit of that today. That's a great question. And you know what? I'm going to take a note of that to make sure that I include that in the notes here as a question, as a topic, to make sure that I answer in the output notes here. Absolutely. I really like that question. Thank you for that question, Anthony. Murad is here on Twitch. How you doing there? Nikos in Greece. Welcome. Renee, how you doing there in the Philippines? Farrell, welcome in from Cape Town. Hope you're having a good evening there. Why was there a New York skyline photo in the background? Asks Narnia expert. That wasn't New York. That was Philadelphia. It's always sunny in Philadelphia. Yes. If you rewind and go back, that's Philadelphia. Actually, I can just pop. That's Philadelphia. That's not New York. That's the Comcast Tower on the far right, Liberty 1 and Liberty 2, the pyramid there going across. That's the Philadelphia skyline. So absolutely. Hello to you, Tarragona, Spain. That is Rainier. Welcome. Gabriel has a question. How would I implement a unit class in C# similar to what you have in F#? What do you mean by unit class? Give me a little bit more context around that. What do you mean by unit? Implementing classes in C# and F# are very similar. So let me know. I'm going to get some music playing in the background here. I'm going to go with our synthwave playlist from Stream Beats. I'm going to scroll down here a little bit and let's start with this song. This is called Codename Indigo. There we go. I like to have a little bit of music in the background as we write code together to kind of fill the gaps and just make it sound groovy while we're writing code. Big thanks to Harris Heller and his team of creators at streambeats.com for putting together this music that's free, DMCA free, that we can listen to in the background as we write code together today. Ooh, did chat break? All of a sudden there's no messages. No, I see messages on the screen here next to me. I think we're okay. Yeah, what do you mean by a unit class? Help me out with that question. But all of a sudden chat stopped. It's like all of a sudden all these voices just were silenced. How are we doing there? There's Zillion. Yeah, oh, there we go. Coming in. All right. We do have the chat room there. So, yeah, see, that popped up on YouTube. There we go. Class that acts like void. If you have a generic class and you want to pass a void. Why would you want to pass void? No. That isn't a thing you can do in C#. In C#, everything is an object. So that's not something you can really do, Gabriel. So how you doing there? Chris Jones on Twitch. Good to see you. Alan, from Uganda. What design pattern do functions use or are supported? Azure Functions are that serverless pattern. You can write functional model code. I'm not going to say style, but each individual method that we write runs on its own with no collaboration with the others. So there's ways around that. There's ways to do more with it. There's even a concept that they call durable functions that allows you to generate what you may have heard of in other architecture patterns as sagas, so that you can interact, build, tune, and have multiple functions trigger other functions and fan out and provide additional capabilities. So, right, void in C# void means nothing returned. So, wanting to pass in and say, I want nothing returned from this, you don't typically do that in C#. Passing into a generic like that. So that you don't have to create two generics. No. There's, if you look at the signatures for actions and functions, there's dozens of signatures that scale out and allow you to specify the multiple items. Yeah, that's not something that that we do in C#. All the signatures are there because it's easy enough to generate and add a override. Nikos asks, are we going to see functions v4 isolated? I was going to do in process to start. I was going to touch briefly on isolated. It's not something I don't want to confuse folks bouncing back and forth between isolated and in process. I wanted to show in process and focus on in process. I think it's significantly easier for new developers to use. I get that isolated is where things are going, but I'd like to start with in process. It's still going to be supported for some time, and I'd like to focus on that a little bit. But I can certainly show isolated as well. They do have middleware. Dependency injection is also available in process, but I'm gonna stick a little bit with in process as well. So, how you doing there? Hop in the cloud. Mark on YouTube says, this week I've been using Pipes IPC for the first time to have two WinForms apps talk to each other. Very cool. That I'm happy for you that you found a good way to get those applications communicating with each other. As a web developer, I like using things like SignalR to facilitate that type of fan-out communication, being able to stand up a server in the cloud and act as that relay. Whether it's in the cloud or it's in your own data center, you can do that with SignalR to pass those messages around as we're going to see, not next week, we're going to have off for the holiday, but the week after, I think, is when we're going to get into queues and service bus, and we might get into event grid in that one. We'll see. Hey, Billy Bad Bones, hello. Since upgrading to 2022, you keep getting these warnings that declared objects can be null. Yes, it's especially hard to get rid of for classes. This is because this is what you're seeing there, Billy, is the new nullability pattern that is being encouraged with C# and .NET projects. You can turn that off as a switch inside your CS proj file. There is a nullability setting that you can configure in there. Let me grab the entry from the documentation. Nullability. There we go. And you can turn that on and off. Where is it? There's an argument, there's a setting to turn off the null checks. Yes. You can turn that on and off, and you can turn on the, yeah, here we go. And you can also dictate how much of an error it throws. There's a link in chat to turn on and off nullability. It's literally an entry. There's a little XML thing that says nullable and it says enable. Change it to disable, and then all those error messages will go away. I think it's disable and it goes away. So, but by default, it's enabled now, and you can just turn it off, and they'll go away for you. But that is something that a lot of folks do appreciate, having the nullability checks turned on, because it reduces the number of times that you're going to accidentally run into passing null around and getting a null value where you weren't expecting it. You're never going to see a null reference exception. As somebody who's worked with nulls for decades, working with .NET, it annoys me a little bit too. So, let me see here. All right, continuing through. How you doing there, Napalm? Good to see you. Mark has a question about nulls as well. Sure, bring it on. Happy to answer. McNets, good to see you on Twitch. Marcus Voice Coder says it's a lot easier when you have a new project. Yes, going back and turning on null checks in older projects can help increase their quality a little bit, can introduce and push you towards design patterns that are going to help you. So, they're not a terrible thing. It's definitely a design pattern that some folks don't enjoy. How you doing there, D in Greece? Good to see you there on YouTube. It's not bad to turn off the nullability checking. It's a choice that you're making to say, hey, compiler, I don't need you to tell me when nulls might occur. That's okay. We've been doing that for years and years and years. It's an additional safety warning that is helping you build your applications better. Maybe a mass transit showcase one day? Perhaps. Perhaps we can talk about mass transit in the future. Sure. I'm happy to take that as a possibility. You did what code? I don't see anything. Humongous Fungus, hello, hello. Yeah, I don't... Sorry. I don't see. You find that you do a lot of late binded classes from interfaces. You would have to constantly check, well, late binding classes from interfaces. Yeah, you need a default that you're declaring. You need to assign an initial type an initial instance when you declare a variable of an interface, so it can get a little hairy. You can also override by putting an exclamation point at the end and have it basically force the compiler and say, by saying, I know this is going to be null, and I'm okay with that. Don't check any further for this. So, Mark asks, using SignalR, I guess I could still, from a WinForms client, send data tables to a web server using SignalR. Yes. Yes. I worry about you sending data tables to a web server. Sending a lot of data in a data table that's a lot. That's a hairy operation. Not something that I would encourage, but rather encourage sending as little data as possible, because if you're sending a big data table back and forth that has dozens, hundreds of rows in it, what value are you getting out of sending all of that back? Is it all brand new content that you're inserting all at once into the server? In which case, the data table might not be the most optimal way to send it. If you've updated and edited some of that data in the table, well, why are you sending it all back? Why not just send back the changes? You end up with a smaller payload, and you end up being able to work with that a little bit easier on the server, instead of on the server having to inspect and go back and forth and compare to the database and do a lot of work on that. So, and if you deleted records, now on the server you have to check, well, do these records still exist? And decide to delete them from your data store. So, I hear you about sending data table back and forth. I would encourage you to inspect and consider more discrete updates that you're communicating back and forth to your server. So there's options there, but what you're doing isn't wrong. But I think there's a little bit more smaller and discrete ways that you can send data back and forth that will result in smaller network use, better use of your server resources, so that you can deliver content faster, more efficiently. Marcus Voice Coder says, recording null sometimes after playing whack-a-mole with all the warnings, I end up breaking the program in Visual Studio by inadvertently changing something I should not. Understood, and this is where healthy testing, unit testing, integration testing practices can help with that. Continuous integration with unit tests to support that can help you grow your application and make it more reliable, durable, because you're pushing out the use of nulls, potential for null reference exceptions, and you're also then ensuring that your application always functions the same way. So, polling for changes, polling. I don't know about that. Gabriel on YouTube asks, when implementing logging in CQRS, what else do you normally log besides requests and responses? Well, are you talking about logging as a cross-cutting concern, or are you talking about logging as in an event stream? I want to make sure I understand the question correctly. If you're talking about logging as that cross-cutting concern of, I received a message, I acted on it, and I sent the message, and I completed and sent it back, there are other pieces of business logic and capabilities in there that you might want to log as well. What business decision was made, how you interacted with database or other third-party microservices, how those interactions occurred. If there's business logic that occurs, you might want to log how those decisions were made, so that when you dial up your logging sensitivity, I want to see a full trace of what happened. You can see, well, here's how the business decision was made. I received this information, it transformed into this. because I added in this extra information from a microservice or from a database or from something on disk, and I made these decisions. Here's how I made that decision. You may want to include that information for trace logging, not necessarily debug logging, but of course you also want to log when errors occur. I wasn't able to connect to this service. This machine, this capability was not available. And you want to be able to log those as errors, not just requests and response. So while request and response is a good place to start with logging inside of not just CQRS, but any system, you want to be able to log those errors when you can't connect, a machine is down, services aren't behaving like they expect to be, something takes too long to respond. Log those warnings, log those errors. On Twitch, Narnia Expert asks, what are the odds of a Maui application making it through the approval process for Apple's Mac and iOS app stores? Very high. We have a number of Maui applications, before that Xamarin and Xamarin Forms applications being approved and deployed to the Apple, both Mac and iOS stores. Yes. So you absolutely can do that. That's something that the Xamarin, now Maui team ensures when they deliver that framework. Mr. Aquater, I hope I've read that correctly, on YouTube asks, where can I find resources that show how to write integration tests? I don't know if I need to use Web Application Factory or something else. So if you're talking about if you're talking about integration tests for ASP.NET Core, take a look at Playwright, playwright.dev. That's a tool that we've been working on to help make exercising your applications easier. You can certainly use Web Application Factory so that you can start up and interact with Razor pages and components in your application without actually traversing, opening a browser and interacting with things, but more triggering and going and seeing exactly how the various components of your application work. What I like about Playwright is it's built on top of browser technology. You'll get an instance of Chromium, of Chrome, of Safari, of Firefox that it will instrument and it will instruct to navigate, inspect, and interact with your website. When I think about integration tests, that's the type of test that I want. Actually go to this thing. Click the button. Did the response I expect occur? So check that out at playwright.dev. My colleague Debbie O'Brien is leading the community work for Playwright, building all kinds of training videos, training resources, content for you to learn about that, working on the reference material and documentation. Really good stuff there. That's something that's going to help you get started with that type of integration testing for a web application. When I think about using Web Application Factory, that feels more like a unit test, even though you are able to do everything kind of in memory without it. That's okay. That's a nice practice. But for me as a web developer, I want to see what actually happens. And Playwright actually has features to be able to take a screenshot when an error occurs and give you that screenshot as an image, as part of the report. Works great with XUnit, NUnit, so you can test your web applications. Sander on YouTube loves the C# videos. You're very welcome. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you for joining us today. It's a lot of stuff that we do each week here, training and talking about various, not just language features, but framework features that we can use. Too Much Hassle. How you doing there? Friend on Twitch says OpenTelemetry is now a part of .NET since .NET 6. It is. You still need to understand when you want to push information over into your telemetry so that it can get picked up. So deciding on that is a big decision, right? Exactly what are we logging? So it is possible to log too much, but don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to spread the logger around there a little bit. McNets on Twitch asks, Blazor versus Razor. Things are pushing more in the direction of Blazor. There's a lot we can do with Blazor. Blazor is more, it is, so to be clear, Razor is a templating language. Blazor is a user interface framework that uses Razor. So one is encompassed in the other. Razor, however, is used in non-interactive user interfaces like ASP.NET MVC and Razor pages. They generate HTML, and after that HTML is generated, Razor is done, hands it off, and it gets delivered into your browser or as a string somewhere for you to work with. Blazor, on the other hand, listens and has an event model that listens inside that markup so that as events occur, it can respond, reformat, and inject new markup for you into that document. So Blazor is more interactive than Razor. Very cool stuff. And folks are pivoting and going more and more towards Blazor because you can generate Razor components that you can use in your Razor pages, in your MVC application, with Blazor style syntax. So I would definitely encourage you to check out Blazor. And of course, Blazor works everywhere. Render on a server, render in a web browser, just like a single page application, and build and develop hybrid applications with .NET Maui. Marcus voice coder on Twitch says, I believe because Playwright is so easy to use, it's best to test there first, then think about unit tests. That's not a bad idea. I can buy that. The testing that you will write with Playwright, and now there's a user interface you can use to generate tests. Navigate to your application, click through it using the Playwright UI, save that test, and now you've got exactly that thing that you've been doing over and over again. All right, open the website, click the link, do the thing. Did it work? You've got it saved. Now the next time you need to do that, you don't have to open a browser, refresh, click the link, do the thing. No, let Playwright do that for you and tell you the result, so you don't have to think about it. And you can even run that during your continuous integration process, so that when things build, it'll click the link, do the thing, get the result, and you'll know. So, Marcus, I'm going to agree with you a bit there. Because they've made Playwright so easy to use, there's extensions you can use with Visual Studio Code. And like I said, there's a visual tool you can use now to build and generate your tests. Go get yourself some Playwright. It is an amazing tool that's going to help you as a web developer. And it doesn't matter whether you're a .NET developer or a Node developer. There are tools for your favorite language there at playwright.dev to integrate with your favorite testing tools and generate web tests. Latior is here on Twitch. Hello. Good morning to you. The UI mode is very promising. Stefan, how you doing there on YouTube with a big smile? Let me see here. Yeah, thumbs up from McNets on Twitch. Schmikey, hello to you on YouTube. Welcome. Do I think Blazor will find its place instead of regular TypeScript and single-page applications? Well, will it find its place? Yes. Single-page applications in TypeScript have been around for a very long time. It's going to take some time to displace that. I think what Schmikey says there on YouTube, Blazor United is cool. I think that is going to be a big change that really wakes up some people. It's it's ironic to me that folks in the Ruby on Rails and JavaScript worlds are building server-side rendering capabilities like what we had in classic ASP, and the type of magic Ajax panel like we had in ASP.NET Web Forms, and view state like we had in ASP.NET Web Forms. These things that were the bane of our development process. Those folks are building exactly those technologies, developing it and saying, check out this amazing thing that I invented. It's so cool. It solves problem X, Y, and Z. It makes your application stateful. It means you can refresh just this chunk of the web page and you don't have to worry about the rest of it and write all this other code. Yeah. We had that in 2004, 20 years ago. Check out the blog posts. It's been around for a while. But okay, now you're doing it with Ruby or Node, Angular, TypeScript. That's great. Everything comes back around. Blazor United is really going to bake some people's noodles, and I think there's going to be a lot that people are going to start paying attention to around .NET because it is so productive and easy to build with. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a groundswell of people that come over to .NET, but I think some folks are going to start paying more attention when they see how easy it is to use. DJ Homer on YouTube. How you doing there, DJ? As a beginner, you want to ask, how do you measure the performance of an application? Could we compare a .NET backend service with Razor Pages versus .NET backend with a JavaScript framework like React? So there are ways to measure that. If you're running on Azure, we have Application Insights that runs out there that'll tell you the response times of your web server, of your functions, of your capabilities that you're running out there. It'll give you that relative response time. There's other tools that we have like benchmark.net that we can point to methods and features, and you can run and see exactly how long things take to execute and tune and tweak with that. But you're talking about two different types of technologies there. Rendering on the server with Razor Pages versus running a backend API and having a JavaScript framework that's delivered and renders in the browser, making requests back to the server. Those behave two different ways. You're going to see two different levels of performance from them. The application that renders on the server can cache on the server, and quite frankly is going to feel significantly faster with that level of caching when you do interactive things that work with the server. However, on the other side, if you're doing things that don't need to interact with the server and you're just manipulating the content on screen, well, that's all being cached and run on the server. That can be done locally with the JavaScript and feel and run much faster. So it's two different things. Can you measure the performance between the two? Sure. You're going to see in these cases where we're pushing and interacting with data on the server, that's going to run and feel faster. When we're manipulating things on screen, that React app is going to feel faster. So two different things to consider, but also an opportunity for us as developers to choose the technology that will best fit those two approaches, right? Those two, both opportunities and limitations. And that's where folks are talking about Blazor United and are getting excited, because Blazor United says, well, with one code base, I'm going to write this one code base, and it's going to render and cache a whole bunch of content on the server. And while you're interacting, when you make that first request, we're going to give you what's rendered and running on the server. But while that's delivered, in the background, we're going to make all that Blazor WebAssembly content available and load in the background so that we can hand off that interaction, hand off that processing so that the things that can work best inside the browser run with WebAssembly. And the things that need to interact with and render on the server, and the server does that better, it's going to hand off and do that on the server. And the projection where they're projecting this technology to land is you don't have to think about where the code runs. The compiler and the framework and the runtime are going to decide on the fly for you so that you as a developer just build your application. And the goal is it will run where it runs fastest for your developers. And that is as an aspiration for a framework, is an amazing, amazing thing. So we're looking forward to see how that develops. And we'll hear more over the next few months with Microsoft Build coming up, events over the summer, and pushing towards release candidates in the fall. So lots more coming on that. Latyor on Twitch says, hello, Fritz. I'm wondering what you would say to new developers and people worried about studying programming in the age of Copilot and ChatGPT. You're having a problem with job search. Copilot and ChatGPT are tools. Neither one of them know how to write applications. They know how to interpret text. That's it. There is no thinking. There is no brain that's making decisions on things. It knows how to read and interpret text. It so happens that some of that text is code. Copilot knows how to take that code and make sure that it compiles for your language of choice. That means you can generate code based on prompts that you pass into it. That means you can write code faster. That means you can generate more complex code a little bit easier. You don't have to type as much. Is it going to put you out of a job? No, not in the least. It's going to help you write more interesting, more complex code than if you were to try and figure it out yourself and work with the compiler to make sure things compile. You're getting that help based on code that other folks have written. Just like other folks have written runtimes and frameworks like Blazor, React, TypeScript. You are now standing on the shoulders of those people who wrote code that works with those frameworks and runtimes. And so on and so forth. The people who get into development 20 years from now are going to be depending on code that you or your colleagues wrote and leveraging those capabilities at that point in the future. This is a cyclical thing. These are new tools that folks are writing to make it easier for you to write code. In 5 to 10 years, there's going to be even more tools that make it easier for you to write more complex code. It continues to happen. This is where we go. This is how things develop. 50 years ago, my father was writing code using punch cards. Punch cards! Literally had a hole punch and was punching holes in a piece of cardboard about this big. And that's how he programmed with Fortran. And now we write code with .NET. So things evolve, and it helps enable you to write more code more faster. That's a good thing. Jorge asks, how you doing there on YouTube? Maui, with or without Blazor hybrid? I like to mix. I like to mix it a little bit because I think there's things that the native tools and components do better. And when you're ready to extend the application, extending with hybrid, I think, is a lot more flexible than the native components. So, Parker on YouTube asks, would Blazor be more comparable to a meta framework such as Next.js? No. I would. Blazor is a complete framework that I would compare to Angular or React. Blazor United is supposed to be the best of both worlds. That's right, Marcus on Twitch. What about architecture elasticity? Asks Stefan, like Kubernetes and other architecture orchestration tools. What about it? These tools that we're using, like ASP.NET, like Blazor, they work very well with Kubernetes, with containers and those things, because you can stand up multiple instances and they know how to collaborate. So give me a little bit more background on your question there, where you're looking to go with that. We can certainly talk further. Zero Dev says, why don't you just use Vim or Emacs? Because I want to be productive. I want to be able to build things quickly, have the tools, technologies, and debuggers and loggers and things built into my tools so I can step through and interact with them without having to spend all day writing scripts to customize my text editor. Vim and Emacs have their place. But you know what? I can do it a lot better, faster, with technologies that are optimized for me to be productive versus just a text editor that we need to layer in dozens of plugins and components and tweak and tune to make that meet my needs. Somebody's already done that. I'm going to leverage and work with the tools and technologies that they've built. I don't know why you don't see your question, Stallone. I don't see it either. I've been reading every question that comes up here. Latyor says that makes sense. So their worry is, how much should one depend on AI-generated code as their starter code and then customize it from there? Don't depend on it as your starter code. No, don't do that. You still need to learn, in the age of AI generating code, you still need to understand what it's generating. If you don't understand what it's generating, then you don't know whether you should actually consume and use that code. There's a lot more to writing code than just asking somebody, hey, can you build a thing for me? Did it build the right thing? Does it function the way you want it to? Could it be tuned, tweaked, made better? Does it solve your problem efficiently and effectively? If you don't know how to read that code and decide whether it's acceptable, then you're not even halfway there in solving your problem. You're welcome, Latyor. CodeMonkey85 on Twitch. How you doing there? You had a problem getting cross-domain cookies to work between a Blazor WebAssembly app and an ASP.NET Core hosted API. Okay, hang on. Cross-domain cookies isn't a thing. You can't do that. Cookies are bound to the domain that they're created on. So, yes, you had a problem with that because you can't do that. Cross-domain cookies is not a thing that you can do. People hide that by embedding iframes and other tools, images inside their web pages so that it fetches that thing from somewhere else. And quite frankly, that's something that privacy laws like GDPR and the California privacy laws are fighting against, those types of practices. So I would discourage you from trying to do that. And I would encourage you to do things like passing headers with your tokens between your WebAssembly app and your API, so that that header that you're passing is intentionally being used versus pushing a cookie where folks can turn that off because for privacy reasons. So, how you doing there, Thin Dog? Good to see you there on Twitch. About Kubernetes, Stefan says, referring to the fact that Blazor United guesses where to run what. No, guesses between server and it's supposed to be able to guess between server and client side. It's not going to decide to run it somewhere else in an orchestrator. It's going to decide, does this run better in the browser or does it run better on the server? So, no, sorry. Wrong location there, Thindall. You understand the code, but sometimes want to see different ways of doing it, using generated code as inspiration. Sure. Then keep talking to ChatGPT and particularly if you if you use Bing Chat, that version of ChatGPT. It'll give you links for more information when you talk to it. So, the rule of thumb used to be never copy and paste code, says Marcus Voice Coder. You don't understand, but it's the same with Copilot. It is the same with Copilot. Understand the code a little bit that you copy and paste so you understand it. Cross-origin cookies, same issue. Cross-origin resource sharing is one thing, but cookies will be blocked when you work with that. Why do Azure resources, the cloud services, asks MS, why do they run by a third party in China while Azure government is run by Microsoft? Because Microsoft is based in the United States and runs the Azure government cloud in the United States. And as an export, as a non-local company, active in China, Canada, different locations in Europe, having verified government-approved vendors manage those facilities means that Microsoft doesn't own and operate that data, but provides the technologies that those folks, those companies run the data centers. So it becomes local, managed by local organizations in that country, but still sponsored and delivered in part from Microsoft. So everybody feels better about that type of thing, having local ownership for those regions. I'll answer just a few more questions and then we'll move into the topic today. Narnia Expert asks, what version of Visual Studio is needed to use ChatGPT to write software? There is no... We don't have that capability right now. You can use GitHub Copilot with both Visual Studio 2019 and 2022. So, H4 Games, how you doing there on YouTube? You're learning so much from the streams. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate having you here, H4 Games. Problem you're trying to solve is storing a refresh token for your API on the client, sending that token with HTTP requests. Yes, store it in the client. Go ahead. Storing tokens like that on the client you can do with browser storage, session storage, app storage. That's available. That runs inside your domain, and using that to make HTTP requests, you can absolutely do. I do that all the time with the ClipTalk application. You can absolutely do that with local storage. You could use cookies, but you can also have folks opt out. That was a challenge that we had with the ClipTalk application. Folks would say, you're not allowed to store data inside my browser. Okay, then you don't put it in app storage. You put it somewhere in memory, and they don't get that refresh capability. Sorry. And they have to log in again. But that's their decision that they made. And for us as web developers, we have to manage and accommodate that. That's the law. That's the way the world wants to work with websites. Sometimes folks don't want to be remembered between interactions. Yeah, the new GitHub Copilot features. I don't know if they're making those features as extensions in older versions of Visual Studio. They'll certainly work in 2022. I don't have access to any kind of preview yet. I'll let you know when we do. And of course, I'll be using it here live on streams when it does become available. So, just double checking. Thought I saw a thing pop up here. All right. Cool. Yes, Scott did release some videos about the new GitHub features. It was about a week or so ago. But yes, when they announced it, that stuff was made available. Will WebAssembly potentially die or be an optimal replacement for JavaScript? Asks Manoj. It's part of the HTML5 standard. So no, it not only will it not die, but there are additional technologies like WASI that are being developed that use WebAssembly that you're going to see more and more frameworks and tools be built to target, because there's a lot of interesting things we can do with that common runtime that everybody can target and communicate across. There's a portability and interoperability that happens with WASI that you just can't do with any other technology. That's exciting stuff. WebAssembly isn't going anywhere. Bard.net. Is Microsoft ever going to fix SSDT? You're going to have to talk to SQL Server folks about that. I can't speak towards that. Does this mean Azure service is not encrypted and any cloud service provider can expose everything? Why the government didn't take the roles like third party in China? No, MS, no. You've run off the deep end here. No, Azure services are absolutely encrypted. However, there are laws in various countries that data for governments has to be owned and managed by local companies inside their borders. They issue certifications that say, yes, these organizations, these facilities meet our security needs, our localization needs, so they keep them in their country. Wouldn't folks in the United States be frustrated, be annoyed, be concerned if government data was stored on a service in another country, in Brazil, in Spain, in South Africa? Americans would not be happy with that their government data was being stored outside their borders. Same goes for folks in China, Germany, Canada. They want their government data stored local to their government inside their borders. So it works both ways. Fine. Here's the technology so that you can stand up and manage that, and they're certified and approved to do that. The data is absolutely encrypted. That doesn't mean that folks fully trust those providers, and they have those requirements for valid security reasons that they want their data owned and managed in their borders by their citizens. And that's okay. That's perfectly reasonable, and Microsoft is facilitating those providers to be able to provide those services. We're getting some really good questions here. I'm going to go a little bit long on the AMA and to talk about this a little bit. WASM is the new Java applets. No. WASM is different than Java applets. WASM is the new JavaScript sandbox. Java applets was a square of functionality that popped up on screen. Java applets and Flash were the same, and Silverlight. Those were all the same. A chunk of HTML that was replaced with some executing code. We're swapping out the runtime that runs inside the browser. That's not the content we're looking for here. So the music changed. We might have a problem with that. There we go. Moving on here. Yes, Azure storage is encrypted at rest. Yep. Excuse me. Stallone on YouTube asks, can you explain the difference between ASP.NET, Blazor server, WebAssembly, and Razor pages? Oh, that's a lot here. Okay. ASP.NET is our server-side web framework technology. It allows you to host, render, and deliver web content. That's a large framework that's composed of several different technologies for interacting with APIs, for rendering HTML. Among those is Razor Pages. Razor Pages uses the Razor templating language to generate and manage content, HTML content, using the Razor template technology in a page-first architecture. The other UI rendering technology that we have for ASP.NET is called MVC. Mary Victor Charlie. Model View Controller is what MVC stands for. MVC allows you to break up those requirements to build a user interface so that you have model classes, you have a view that's built with the Razor templating engine, and you have a controller that handles requests, interacts with a model, passes that off to a view, renders that as HTML, and returns it to the viewer. So that's what ASP.NET is. That's what Razor Pages are. Blazor, specifically Blazor Server, is a way for you to write code using the Razor templating engine such that it renders on the server, but it's interactive. As you click and interact with that, there are events that trigger, and on the server, it will re-render that code and push it back into the browser. It will push it back into the browser. There isn't a request response. It pushes into the browser. WebAssembly, though, takes the server out of the mix, and instead of having to go back to the server to get pieces of the web page rendered and pushed back into the page for you, instead, it all runs just like JavaScript in the browser. But you're writing with that Razor templating technology and C#, and it runs inside the browser. So, Silverlight was its own runtime. Java was its own runtime. Flash was its own runtime. Yes, you're right. Oversimplifying, Thindall says, could you compare WebAssembly to compiled JavaScript? Compiled JavaScript is not really a thing, but yes, you could compare WebAssembly to JavaScript in that it's a binary runtime that runs in the browser. Yes. JavaScript runs in the browser. WebAssembly runs in the browser. So, Manoj asks, our Azure services are by default encrypted at rest with Microsoft keys and TLS 12 and Translate. Microsoft offers bring your own key to use your own key and options. The owner of the data center encrypts and handles the content at rest. And TLS is used in transit. Yes. It's not TLS 12, it's TLS 1 and 2. Yes. But the local vendors manage and handle that. And that's about the extent of my knowledge of that. We're getting right off the deep end of what I know about Azure management on that. You think WebAssembly is here to stay like HTML and CSS? I agree. They ran out of processor and their output got inserted into the browser. No. So inside the US, the federal government takes the responsibility, same as the model you explained for third party doing in China. No. The Azure government cloud that's used in the States, the federal government the US federal government has certified and approved that it's isolated, it's not public, and it meets their security guidelines. Microsoft runs that in the States. Microsoft is a local company in the States and runs that for them. Same as a third party, a local China company running the Chinese government cloud for them in China. So, Hammer88 on YouTube asks, can WebAssembly save to database locally like some program in Windows? It can. Excuse me. You can write to app storage, you can write to session storage in the browser, and folks have written adapted SQLite, the SQLite database, so that you can install the SQLite database in app storage in the browser and interact with that using WebAssembly. absolutely you can do that. Do I recommend folks do that? It's a little heavy to do. You're taking up a lot of disk space. There might be a valid trade-off on that if you've got a lot of data that folks want to be able to interact with, and you can cache it locally. And when I say a lot of data, I mean tens of megabytes. You start getting above 100 megabytes, and that's rude to store on somebody's browser. Unless you're in a corporate application and you own the computers that are allowed to interact with that internal application, well, then you can make that decision for yourself. But on the public internet, that's a little rude to store a lot of data there. And quite frankly, folks can opt out of that by turning off cookies and local storage in their browser. And then your application needs to still be able to handle that. Local DB is different. Thindall. Renee started learning COBOL. Fantastic. Yes. Customers do need to understand that their own hardware that they keep locally is always going to be a lot less secure than in a cloud service where folks are literally, it's their job to ensure that it's secure up there. Will it be secure? What do you mean by secure? Right, local storage, not local DB. Local DB is something else. What is secure when you send data to somebody in their browser? It's delivered over transport layer security, SSL. That's the old term we used to use for it, but now TLS, transport layer security. It's stored in the same isolated sandbox that cookies are, where you can't jump domains and access that content. The only way to access local storage content is to execute code. Folks can't embed an image from another domain and get it to execute code. That's a cross-domain violation and gets blocked in the browser. So, local storage is fairly open. Yes, it can be accessed if SQL injection happens. It can be accessed, but in order for SQL injection to happen, yeah, you've got another problem on your browser. WebAssembly can write to any. How you doing there, Blazor, Mr. Magoo? Can write to any storage it has been granted access to. Yes. Running it on the server is different than running it in the browser. The browser doesn't have full access to the disk. There is a very small dedicated area that you're allowed access to, and there's a maximum size. And I think it's 100 meg that you're allowed to. I forget exactly how big it is. It varies, but there is a limit there. You can grant it access to files on disk. I'd like to see that. By default, it does not. No, you can't get it to install SQL Express. File system API? I haven't seen people use this. I'm assuming that needs to be granted explicit access. And that feels very much like a Chrome OS feature that they're trying to do. Yeah. That screams danger to me. That screams danger because folks are going to abuse that and trick people into doing things. Can you install SQLite and store the DB files in local storage? Yes, and folks do that. And I'm not a fan of that. There's ways that we could use that and do some interesting things. I'm not a fan of it. All right, we've gone a bit long here, and we had some really good questions. I wanted to make sure that we answered that we got to. Let's start talking about Azure Functions, shall we? Let's talk about things that we can do with Azure Functions inside of our applications, because I'm a big fan of what we can do with this. It's the serverless capabilities for us as web developers gives us flexibility to scale and grow our applications in crazy ways that, quite frankly, take a lot of plumbing and a lot of code to make work that you can do with just a couple lines of code and connecting up and getting these functions talking to each other. Let's head over to the code and we can start looking at this. All right. So that's not the right button. Oh, darn it. It's this one. That's the wrong scene. There we go. There we are. So this is the intro to Azure Functions page inside the documentation. Quite frankly, Azure Functions are a way for you, and here's the address. I'll get rid of the culture marker in the middle of it. Azure Functions are a way for you to write a lot less code. You don't have to worry about the runtimes and management of your application, and it will scale appropriately to handle and give compute to be able to handle the amount of work that you throw at it. This means that our model that we think about our applications changes. When you build a web application, you think about some sort of a server, a physical piece of hardware, or maybe it's a virtual machine, or it's a container that's sitting out there that has a web server running in it that's going to spin up and has a capacity. It can listen to and work with 100 people concurrently, 1,000 people concurrently, 10,000 requests concurrently. That's great. What happens when you hit that limit? Now you need to scale, which means that everything that runs and manages that website, the web server, all of the logging capabilities around that, the networking needs to be duplicated, and we use things like containers to now stand up a second one. We use technologies like Kubernetes to orchestrate and load balance between them. We'll set up some sort of a proxy that knows how to talk between the two instances, and eventually that gets full, and we end up scaling and standing up another one, and so on and so forth. When we think about serverless technologies, we're going to throw all of that management out the window. We don't care. We're going to be able to build systems that react to events. We call them triggers. Somebody requests some content. Go execute that little bit of content and return it. Done. It doesn't run as a server. We don't have to manage that server. We just give the function's runtime a little bit of code, a function, a method. We tell it, run this when an appropriate request comes in, and it will process and handle that. And when there's pressure, oh my gosh, I can't handle more requests for that method that Fritz wrote. I'm running out of processor capacity, memory capacity. The runtime automatically stands up additional resources to be able to handle that additional pressure. In this way, then, we don't need to think about how we manage the web server, how we handle logging, the resources to run that. You only care about, you wrote those couple lines of code that are being triggered and responded to by our server. Okay. So all of that management, you give up control over so that you can focus on the scalability and the delivery of just that little block of code. and that trigger. Now, that trigger could be somebody making an HTTP request. That trigger could be an entry arrived on a file system somewhere, or an entry in a queue or a service bus, event grid. There's all kinds of scenarios that you could get into and trigger, hey, I need a little piece of code to run when this event happens. Not just, there was a request for this API. But things like, well, record changed in the database, go do this other thing. Okay? I got data from an IoT device. It reports that there's a moisture, there's a humidity of 98% in Fritz's basement. Hey, we might want to sound an alarm. 98% humidity sounds like there might be a water problem going on there. Send a notice to Fritz's phone. That's a function. It receives a little bit of information and decides to do something with that and sends off that process. We could process file uploads. Gosh, there was an image that was uploaded and it's really big. It's a great portrait of Fritz. But we'd like that in black and white and thumbnail size at 150 by 150 pixels so we can put it on our webpage as a profile picture. You can do that. You can write a little block of code that sees an image, an original image gets uploaded into a folder. We're going to take it, run a little bit of code against that to turn it black and white, resize it appropriately, and save it off somewhere else where we can use it on the public site for a profile image. These are what functions are. Write a little bit of code, dedicated code that does one thing and does one thing really, really well. That single responsibility principle, right? The S in our solid architecture concepts. Do that one thing really well and return. And it'll run really, really fast in the Azure Data Center, where it can be isolated and scaled appropriately as more requirements come in to trigger that. Taking a look here, catching up on chat. I'm gonna focus on the topic here, and folks who have questions about other things, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna answer that. We're outside the AMA mode. Aren't all portraits of Fritz great? Well, congratulations there, Renee. All the best on that. All right. Azure Functions run on all different languages. You see a couple of them here: C#, Java, JavaScript, PowerShell, Python. You can use a custom handler to use virtually any language. We're going to focus on C#, building and deploying using. And I want to focus on in-process mode. There's two different modes that you can build and deliver functions. We'll talk about that briefly here. So the important, really cool thing that I like about it is this bit right here. There's two different ways that you can stand up functions. Of course, nothing runs completely free in the cloud. But there is a consumption plan and there's a premium app service plan that you can use. The premium app service plan says, I'm going to take control of how many instances are deployed of this. I'm going to manage the construction and availability of that app service. And we did get app service deployment working. We'll show you that here. But if you run it with the consumption plan, if you decide to build and deploy using consumption billing, you can build and deploy your function, and that's where it will scale automatically for you. And if we look here, the consumption plan is where Azure provides the resources, and you just care about how many times your function runs, versus Premium says you have a pre-warmed set of instances that are always online, and App Service says that you control how many instances you have out there. Functions pricing page. This is where I wanted to go. So there is, I don't want to see, no, pricing example, blah, 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 blah. Show me. No. At the consumption plan, 400,000 gigabytes per second of memory you're allowed to use. And gigabytes per second, right? That's like hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s. That's 16 millionths of a dollar for folks in the States, or 20 cents per million executions. 20 cents. For the price of a cup of coffee, you can run your application 10 million times? Heck yes. That's a good problem to have. Right? That's an amazing problem to have. If you've run your application 100 million times, okay, you have a $50 Azure bill. That's a pretty good problem to have. That's a pretty good problem to have. You've got a lot of folks connecting and using your application at that point, right? So we like that. So I do prefer the consumption plan for building and structuring Azure functions. Yeah. So it's a little block of code that you can execute. And I mentioned there's things out there called triggers. And they control how your function starts. You're going to write a little bit of code that kicks off and starts. And how does it start? Well, there are a bunch of triggers out there that you can use. Where'd it go? There we go. There's a bunch of these triggers that you can use, and there's various version numbers up here. The most common one that I like to use is HTTP. This is basically the API endpoint. When somebody goes to this API endpoint, it's going to do some sort of interaction with data and return some content back to the person that requested that, the machine that requested that, right? This could be an API endpoint that's delivering content for a Blazor application. This could be an endpoint that is receiving and interacting and triggering, sending a text message to someone. It could be all kinds of things. I like to use it as an API endpoint for websites. We'll talk about this a little bit later in April when we talk about Azure static websites. We use a lot of HTTP triggers for functions for that. But blob storage, that's file storage. You have a file that arrives, you want to trigger something, you can trigger based on content in blob storage. Cosmos DB in Azure SQL. So if something changes in these databases, we want to trigger and do something as a function. You can wire that up. Event grid, event hubs, and service bus down here. Those are those same types of queue and even, where's it? Queue storage. Something arrived in a queue. Something arrived in a first in, first out queue. Those are all different queuing technologies. And we want to parse that and do something with that content when it arrives in the queue. An Azure function is perfect for that. Folks that talk about CQRS architecture, Azure functions are great for that because you can define, here's my operator that I want to consume those events and process and do something with that. Denormalize and create these appropriate views of content. Store those events in our event storage service and work with those. You have that flexibility to do that. RabbitMQ, there's another queuing mechanism you can use. SendGrid you can use as an output binding. We'll talk a little bit about output bindings today. I'm not going to get too deep into it. But an output binding is a way for you to say, okay, when we're done processing this data, now put something back in the database. Put something back in the event grid in the event hub for the next thing to go process. Same thing with service bus or queue storage. Okay, I'm done processing this. Now hand it off to the next queue where it'll be further enriched with additional data, or some other interaction will happen that does something with that data to be presented, right? So all kinds of ways to connect together features of your application to be able to, with very little complex architecture, planning and building as a developer, you can focus on doing that one thing really, really well and let all the complex architecture things that these mean do those appropriate things. I don't need to know about, well, how do I get my content serialized and put on the event grid or in the service bus or into Azure Queue Storage? It's a binding. Go stick it in there. I'm done with this, go. And it goes and sits over there, and we can interact with that content later. I want to make sure I also point out that there is a timer trigger that you can use here. It's not a timer output, but it's a timer trigger. So you can do those kinds of scheduled operations. Hey, once an hour, go recalculate some of this aggregate data that our folks are using. Update the dashboard once an hour. And you know what? In the mornings, right before the opening of the stock market, recalculate and run things at 9 o'clock, right before the stock market opens. So it's got the latest, freshest data, and just do that Monday through Friday. I can set up a timer with a cron tab type of signature that here's the schedule I'd like things to run. All right. And we can do that. We can kick that out there and have that run on scheduled basis. Marcus would like their Azure function to take an image of them and add hair. Might I suggest DALL-E for that? I think you might be able to get some help from the from the artificial intelligence bots out there. You can upload an image and say, modify this image to do X, Y, and Z, and it will. Hey there, Don Stefan on Twitch says Azure functions are great. I agree. Anton on YouTube asks, does a trigger get triggered before or after action? The trigger starts the action. So the trigger is what initializes your code and specifies we need to go execute that code. Do triggers have visible impact on performance? No. This is what starts the application. So at its simplest, yes, it has impact on performance because it's what runs your code. This is what kicks off your code. Let's get into some samples. Let's write some Azure functions here to do something cool. So I have Visual Studio running over here. I'm going to create a new project, and I've already selected the Azure function, so I have it in my recent templates over here. So I'm going to call this my first function app. And I'll choose next down here in the corner. It's behind me. Now I can choose the type of function worker that I want. As a .NET application, there are several different models that I can choose in order to run my code. I can have it run with .NET Framework, and there are two versions of .NET Framework runtime available to me, V1 and V4. Don't use these. If you don't need .NET Framework, don't do that. .NET 6 runs in two models. It runs in an in-process model. It also runs in an isolated model. Isolated model is slightly different, has slightly different syntax. It's not as convenient to use. And quite frankly, for folks that are used to ASP.NET, I recommend you use the in-process .NET 6 long-term support version. Isolated is the direction that .NET functions are being led towards. So the short-term support versions of .NET, .NET 5, .NET 7 are only supported in isolated mode, and .NET 5 isn't supported anymore. We've outgrown that version of the framework. So, like I said, isolated is a slightly different syntax. It's where we need to get to, but it's also a bit further off the path of the type of code that you're used to seeing in writing. So for the purposes of getting us started, showing and introducing some of the topic, I'm going to use the in-process older version, the long-term support version that will be supported for at least another year. Because .NET 6 came out in 2021, it'll be supported through 2024. I'll get to the questions there in just a second. We can configure our local runtime storage if we want to test and run things local. Sure, let's do that, right? I think. Yeah, I think I can do that. And we can also enable and build our functions inside of a container. You know what? I'm not going to do that. Let's just run it locally. There are 3 different authorization levels for your functions. This is your way to protect how your functions are executed. So, if you want to ensure that only your capabilities, only your runtimes and features that you've been building are allowed to interact with them, you can turn on whether there's a key at the function level, an admin key that runs across the entire project, or anybody's allowed to execute them. I'm going to make this anonymous just to get us started here and not deal with some of the other trigger security capabilities. I'll show you where those keys are, but we're not going to use that today while we get started. So let me go back to a couple questions that have come up here in chat. Billy Cool on Twitch asks, does the Blob trigger have any options on trigger frequency? For example, if I bulk upload 5 files all at once, can I get 1 request instead of 5? No. It will trigger that function 5 times, once for each of those. It is, Regathian does point out, it is a little bit limited. The isolated version is a little bit different. I prefer not to use the blob triggers because the blob trigger triggers when a file changes or arrives in blob storage, in Azure blob storage. Consequently, if something happens inside your function and it fails, it will never reprocess. That's a problem. That's a little bit of a problem, that you don't have a reprocess capability there. I like to couple the blob trigger with either a timer trigger or a queue, such that if the processing fails on the queue, I can put it back in the queue. I can re-queue it. Or I can put it into my poison queue or a dead letter queue and have something come back through later that can inspect, fix the problem, and complete processing that blob. So while it's really nice to be able to do that, you can run into some scenarios with that when you're trying to do error handling. Additionally, when that trigger has been fired for that blob, at that point you have exclusive access to the blob. If somebody tries to access that blob in another part of your system, they won't have access to it. They'll get an error because it's being processed and you have it inside your function. And if something is long running inside your function, when that other thing is trying to interact with it, now you've got a problem. Now you've got a collision that other thing has to either start retrying. It becomes weird. Catch and continue. Try catch and continue. Yes. But there are scenarios where an error, a significant error can happen and will block and keep you from completing processing. So, on YouTube, TJ asks, will there be a system for bulk data manipulation for Entity Framework in the near future? There is. You're talking about bulk upload. There is. That's a little bit off topic. There are bulk copy features available in Entity Framework. All right. So this is what a simple Azure function looks like. Okay. So our functions have they are a method. Format that a little bit better for me. Thank you so much. And let's take a look at the Solution Explorer so you can see what's in this a little bit. I have just a class file called function1.js. Why function1? It's a default name. The name of this class doesn't matter. You're not going to see the name of this class anywhere. You are going to see the name of this function. This is what's going to be logged inside of your logs, whether it's App Insights, it's something like Datadog, it's something completely different. You're going to see that name logged in the executions for this thing ran. So, right, I could name this, right, Fritz's first function. And it's just a block of text. It doesn't matter. There's the name of it, and the actual name that C# sees for this method and calls is called run. And I can call this whatever I want also. This is a hello world type of function, so let's call it hello world. It's fired by an HTTP trigger. We showed on that previous screen, there's a bunch of triggers that will start our functions. These initialize and kick off here. Well, this looks like an input parameter to this method. It is. And this hint inside square brackets over here is telling the function's runtime, here's how you're going to start this. We're going to start this because of an HTTP trigger. Something is going to make a web request. We're going to handle it and run this code. The first argument passed in is, what's the security level? This allows anonymous interaction. I don't need to pass any kind of a key in order to trigger this. I'll give you some code in the wrap-up documentation that shows you how you can pass in keys and security on that. I have a couple links that I'll have in the final GitHub repository in the README that show how to do that. Next is the HTTP verbs that are supported by this method. In this case, it supports both get and post. You can pass in here put, delete. These other verbs are possible for you to configure the function to listen on and interact with. MJT says, "Hollow world confirmed." Yes, that's right. My typo. And I can also specify the route. What's the address that this listens on for us to interact with? Specifying no route there gives us something interesting by default. We'll see that in a second. Our HTTP trigger has to deliver some sort of a value into our method. By default, we receive an HTTP request. Now, there's other things you can do with this. You can actually bind it to a strong data type. You can actually say, you know what? We're passing in an object of type foo, and it will automatically get bound to that type. I don't recommend doing that, because when you do that type of binding, right? So, right, if I have a public class down here called called hello world input, and it has a property. It's a string called name. I could receive this of type hello world input, and instead of working with the query object, I can say, give me the name that you bound to and pulled out of that request. The danger in doing this, while it's nice to be able to receive that query or the contents of a form and be able to work with that payload directly, the danger is, well, all the request features are no longer available to me. I can't interact with the body of the request. I can't interact with the headers, right? If this is still an HTTP request, while it feels clumsy that I have to reach into the query to pull out a value, I can reach into the headers and look at various values. Now, I don't want to assign a type there. I just tab completed that from what Copilot was suggesting for me, right? But I have the ability to look at cookies. I have the ability to look at information about the host, the path, the scheme. I can read entries automatically from that. So if you need more discrete interactions with things that were submitted as part of that request, additional headers, maybe there's values that you're passing in from the browser, but you're passing them in header in header information, or passing cookies, you lose that binding capability when you do the binding instead of specifying just receive this as a request. Hammer on YouTube asks, comments, I remember when I first started programming, most examples used foo. Foo makes no sense. Yeah, but doing something that's a little bit, right? And Hammer, this is exactly why I host streams like this, because I want to show you more realistic examples. I want to show you and name things more along the lines of what's interesting, something that makes sense, and fill in the blanks here for folks. Can you extend the request class? Asks Billy. Sure, you can extend the request class. So instead of having hello world input, right, I can certainly set up a class. Right, we know how to do extension methods. Public static string get header. Let's call it get region header, right? And thank you. Look at that. Look at that. Come on, tell me you know this. Tell me you're going to figure this out, Copilot. Nope. Get the... yes, that was exactly what I wanted. Let's say return the region header. Look at that. So now when I'm working up here with my request, I can make a decision based on the region header. Right? Now that's interesting. Now that's a little bit more compelling. Now to Billy's question that I think was a little tongue-in-cheek. You've extended and made the request object a little more interesting, so that some of those interactions that you might be doing to pull extra data out of an HTTP request because you're using cookies or headers or interacting with form and query data in a specific way, this makes it really interesting to interact with that. Thank you for the question, Billy. Really appreciate it. Foobar Baz. Yes, that used to be the thing. There you go. A couple folks talking about that in chat. So, okay, I can interact with... So I'm going to receive that request and I can do stuff with it. That's fine. Let me comment that out. So this also receives as an input parameter a logger. I'm not going to recommend you do this for much longer because this is no longer supported going forward with the new versions. But what it's doing is it will bind a logger object to that at startup time when this function is triggered, and you'll be able to log information. Now, there isn't any log entries coming through here. Well, heck, let's use get region header. Let's use that for a second. Get region header, right? We just did that. So I could say, let's say warning, request coming in from the region. And in here, we'll say region. Now that will log that as a warning, right? And I did it as a warning so it appears as different color font. But, right, I can certainly set that to be logged at information level. I'm doing it as a warning so it becomes a little bit easier to see when we run this. So it's going to log some information up front here that says the trigger was fired to process a request. We're going to go get whatever name is passed in on the query string. There's my region work that I did. It's going to read anything that was passed in on the body. So if somebody posts a form that says name equals Jeff, it'll read that data out of there. It's going to format a little bit of a response message that says hello, blah, blah. Hello, Jeff, in this case. This HTTP triggered function executed, and then it's going to return that as an OK object result. So HTTP status 200, and the body of the message returned will be JSON formatted, whatever that response message is. So if I kick this off, if we run this, right? So let's look at what pops up here. So this is the functions runtime that's available for you that comes with Visual Studio. You can get this same tool installed locally. There's installs available from the Microsoft docs. You can also npm install it and download and run this. But notice it has a name for this function, Fritz's first function, which is what was inside the function name. Every function must have a name. If it doesn't have a name, it doesn't appear in the output, right? If I try to run this without that there, it's going to come up and say, I don't have any functions. Because you haven't declared that this is a function, okay? So in order for us to make sure that you have a function in here, it must have a name. So it was named Fritz's first function, not hello world. That's something that can be tricky for folks, for developers or for administrators, because this name is not what's in the code. That's confusing. Let me open and go to that page. Just navigating to that page, I get the HTTP HTTP function triggered successfully, executed successfully, pass a name in the query string. Don't mind if I do. Name equals Jeff, and now it pivots and says, hello, this triggered successfully. Let's look at the log. C# HTTP trigger function processed a request. There's my warning. See how the warning comes up in a different color? And we didn't get a region. It wasn't passed in the headers. Okay. Right. If I go back over here and we execute this network request directly using the network tools that are here, I'm going to resend using Firefox. You see, there's the name that's sent, and look at all these headers here. The region header that we're inspecting is XMS region, right? So if we add that and we say US East, send that. Now, my function runs, and I can see there's the response. I can see the headers that were sent here. But when I look in the log now, there it captured that additional information, right? So you can work with that request the same way you do in ASP.NET, the same way you do in other web technologies here. Great stuff. That gets you the basics of just working with this. Before I go to the questions, as a best practice that I've kind of evolved with, I mentioned how you must have a function name on here, and it can be different from this. Don't use these magic strings. Don't do that. Use the name of operator. The name of statement. This allows you to point to something in code and turn that into text. So, hello world is the name, and I'm missing a paren there, is the name of this method, and that's going to be the name of my function. And you'll also notice that turns into part of the route. So, let's run this one more time. That's too big. There it is. Notice the function is now named hello world, and the route is API/hello world. Okay. I can change that address as well. I can change that to Fritz says hello, let's say. By changing that route, right? By putting something in there, now when I execute this, now it changes, so it's still /API, but it's Fritz says hello, even though the function name is hello world. In this way, if you have multiple versions of a function, right, you have other functions that do similar things, you can name them appropriately and structure your routes how you see fit. I can also bind to elements of the route by doing things here like saying, let's say, location, right? And I can capture that just like I do route parameters, and I can receive that. And I can say down here, if not string is null or empty, location, response message, hello to you in, oh, I forgot the dollar. Location. It should work. I think that works. I forget the optional. It might be a star I'm missing there. So now if we go to that location, well, it doesn't come up. But when I punch in a location here at the end, function triggered HTTP triggered function executed successfully. Pass the name in the query string. Hello to you in Philadelphia. So if I put name equals Fritz. Hello, Fritz. This function triggered successfully. Hello to you in Philadelphia. So I've grown and I've started layering in other capabilities. I thought there was like a star or something here where I can use to mark this as optional. I think that's what it is. Yeah, that's not it. Route parameter cannot contain. Question mark marks it as optional. That's what it is. I knew there was a thing. Run that one more time. Let's show that. And I see a couple questions coming in. I'll read through and answer those in just a second. There we go. So now when I navigate there, it still runs even though I didn't pass in a location. So I'll pass in Philadelphia, name equals Fritz, and the same function still executes, and it gives me the extra location information. So we're binding to part of the route and generating and working with that data. And this could be interact with your database, do all kinds of interesting things. That's great. You can do these things. It's possible. Let me catch up on chat, and then we'll go through, and I'll talk briefly about a queue trigger in here as well. Renee wrote Azure Functions months ago to handle security, secrets at Azure Key Vault. Yep, it works great, but weeks later it vanished. It vanished. I would need to know a little more that's going on there. What is replacing iLogger in the next version? Asks Kung Fury Keyboard. It won't be injected here. In the next version, these are instance scoped classes, and you can certainly run this as an instance, and it will compile and run here. See? So I can still go there and it still executes. But in the next version, they want you to inject those parameters. So that you can then, down here, when you need the logger, now you can work with the hello world logger because it's been injected. You can set up dependency injection with functions. You have to set up a startup, not a startup, a program file that will trigger and get this started. I will add that to the notes about showing that. And that I'll have that included with the sample that I save after this stream. I still have to save and put up the content from the last stream, but we'll get that running. You have to write it again. Don't you have your source code backed up in a source control repository like GitHub or GitLab or something like that? I have seen functions and things disappear because they have an expiration date placed on them. Queues, service bus entries have an expiration date and they automatically get cleaned up. What's the difference between Azure Functions and AWS Serverless? Can this implementation be done for AWS Lambda? I'm only talking about Azure here. There are similar structures that you can use for Lambda, but that's a different topic that some Amazon folks can help you out with. You're thinking about branching into the C# world. Well, thank you. That's great. You want to see the queue trigger? Sure. This seems complicated. This isn't complicated. No. That's not complicated. That's pretty easy to... I mean, we've basically built an API, right? A web API to interact with that. If I want to interact with a queue, right? Maybe I've got information about a user profile picture that we want to interact with, right? I'm going to set up a public async task. This is another function. This is an isolated function that's going to run. And let's call this inspect profile image, right? And this time, instead of an HTTP trigger, we will set up a queue trigger. And I will get the package installed that has all the capabilities for us to interact with the queue trigger. Thank you. We specify a queue name and a connection string to that. So this might be something like the profile image queue. That needs to be lowercase. And there's going to be some connection string. Right, and actually you can pass in a name for this. Actually, inside local settings JSON is the names of our values that are available to us. I'll pass in Azure Web Job Storage, so it knows how to pull from local storage. And what's the shape of that object I'm receiving? It might be a file name that I'm receiving. It might be just a string, but it can be more complex types that will be serialized and deserialized from JSON on disk and loaded into this. So from there now, I can interact with that queue and get this method will be triggered every time there's an entry in that queue, right? So I can use that file name to go open up that file and do something with it and interact here. The other trigger that folks had brought up, I'm not actually going to execute, I'm a little bit over on time, is the blob trigger. And the blob trigger points to a path, right, that I want it to inspect. And then I can specify, well, what's your connection? Well, we're going to go back into Azure Web Jobs Storage. And it will, whenever there's an entry placed into the profile images blob container, think of blob container like a folder, this will trigger. Now, you receive a stream for that you can then inspect and work with. But you're handed the entire file as a stream here that you can work with. Okay? Read the contents of it. If it's a profile image and you want to do some image manipulation, loading that into some sort of an image API is real easy to do when you have a stream. I'll have documents about this with links to more information. Gosh, I feel like we're just scratching the surface. Maybe we do static API, static websites next time. Yeah, I think maybe we do that. But I am out of time here for today. We've gone through and we've covered a lot around Azure Functions. That's not the right song. That's the right song. Let's head back over to the main screen. My goodness. There's a lot to do here, and we've just scratched the surface. Let's come back and talk more about functions and static web apps. Not next week because there's a holiday, but we'll talk the week after. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a pleasure. Just cleaning up here. We should raid NASA? What's NASA up to? Is NASA running here on Twitch? Are they doing a thing? I wouldn't mind raiding NASA. I don't think they allow raids over to NASA. The Artemis 2 they're revealing. That's cool. I think we can send folks over there. But we'll dig in a little bit here. Functions are like minimal APIs. They're like it. They're a little bit different, though. There's all kinds of ways that you can trigger and run them instead of just HTTP. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll have documentation links available on the GitHub repository, linked just below, with more information so that you can learn more about Azure Functions. That'll be coming in the next few days as I finish writing the documentation. Let's see. Can I raid NASA? Let's see if it'll let me. Yes, it will. Thank you so much for watching. Those of you that are watching on YouTube, check out all the great videos that we have linked right over here. There's going to be other folks hosting streams a little bit later on today that you can tune into. And those of you that are watching on Twitch, let's kick off that raid. Let's head over and see the folks at NASA as they introduce, it looks like they're introducing a new rocket. Very cool stuff. Happy to support the folks at NASA pushing science and doing cool new things. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. I wish you good health and good coding. Take care.